Brielle Zander hadn't planned on attending the wedding dinner until her coworker begged her to come as a +1, swearing it would be just food and dancing. She should have known better. Nothing good started with a borrowed dress, a car that barely made it up the mountain road, and strangers in suits who looked like they stepped out of a luxury magazine. She adjusted the thin strap of her black dress as she stepped into the glittering ballroom at Alderwood Estate, instantly regretting her decision. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd with trays of champagne. She felt like a misplaced jigsaw piece in a puzzle made of silk and money. "This is insane," she whispered to her coworker Talia, who was already scanning the crowd for her fiancé. "Insanely gorgeous, you mean? Come on, just enjoy it, Brie, free food." "And trust me, the groom's cousin is single," Talia teased, wiggling her brows. "Hard pass," Brielle replied. "I'm not here to flirt with someone's rich cousin. I'm here for the cake and to leave before I start sweating through this knockoff dress." Talia grinned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Brielle standing awkwardly near the bar. She reached for a flute of champagne, only to find another hand already on the same glass. "Go ahead," a deep voice said. She turned and met sharp blue eyes under dark hair, the kind of eyes that made you forget how to breathe. The man smiled, no, not a smile. It was warmer than that, soft, like it was meant only for her. "Thanks," she said, trying to act like her heart hadn't just picked up speed. "I'm not even supposed to be here. I don't know anyone." "Then we have something in common," the man said smoothly. "I don't know most of these people either. My cousin's wedding. I was dragged here." Brielle laughed. "Same, I'm Talia's +1. She vanished the second we got in." "I'm Beckett Nolan," he said, offering his hand. His grip was firm but not pushy, confident but not arrogant. Brielle Zander. His gaze lingered a moment too long. "Beautiful name," she rolled her eyes playfully. "You probably say that to all the girls you meet at weddings." "I don't meet many girls at weddings. I usually avoid them." "Then what changed tonight?" she asked, raising a brow. He took a slow sip of his champagne. "You walked in." Her stomach flipped, and she hated how easily he did that. "You're definitely trouble," he grinned. "I've been called worse." They ended up seated next to each other during dinner thanks to Talia's not-so-subtle matchmaking, and as the waiters served filet mignon and truffle risotto, Brielle found herself laughing more than she had in months. Beckett was charming, but not in the fake, polished way. He asked questions. He listened. He made her feel like she was the most interesting person in the room. "I'm guessing you don't do this often," he said, cutting into his steak. "What, get roped into expensive weddings I don't belong at?" "No. I'm more of a ramen and Netflix girl." "I like that," he said. "You're real," she tilted her head. "And what are you, Beckett, real or shiny?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Depends who's asking." The band started playing, and the newlyweds hit the dance floor. Beckett stood and held out a hand. "Dance with me." "I'm a terrible dancer. I'll take my chances." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His touch was electric. As they moved slowly on the dance floor, her body fit naturally against his, her head resting near his shoulder. "You're not terrible," he whispered against her ear. "You're a liar," he chuckled, and the sound vibrated through her. "Maybe, but I'd never lie about this. I haven't enjoyed myself like this in a long time." "Same," she admitted. Their eyes met, and for a second, she forgot they were surrounded by people. It felt like they were the only two in the room. Later, as the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Beckett walked her to her car. "I don't want this to end," he said softly. "It's just a wedding dinner," she replied, although her heart ached at the idea of leaving him behind. "It doesn't have to be." She looked up at him, searching his face. "What are you saying?" "Let me take you out. A real date, not a borrowed dress and strangers." She smiled slowly. "Okay," he grinned, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. She blinked. "Wait, what? It's not what you think," he laughed. "Relax." Inside was a delicate silver bracelet lined with tiny sapphires. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked, stunned. "Because tonight felt different, and I wanted you to remember it." "Beckett, this looks expensive. I can afford it." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you do exactly?" He hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. "I run a few companies." "Like what?" "Tech, real estate." "Some investments." You're being vague, he leaned in, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Let's just say I'm not worried about affording dinner, she stared at him. You're rich, he smiled. Millionaire, technically, but I'd rather talk about you, her head spun. Millionaire. The man who slow danced with her under chandeliers and made her laugh over buttered rolls. The man who looked at her like she was something rare. I'm not the kind of girl who chases money, Beckett. I know, he said. That's why I like you. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Just leaned up and kissed him softly. When she pulled back, his eyes were full of something that looked dangerously close to love. I'll call you tomorrow, he whispered. She nodded, heart pounding. Okay. She drove home in silence, the bracelet cold against her wrist, her mind spinning. She'd come for free food and cake. She hadn't expected to meet a millionaire, and she definitely hadn't expected the way he made her feel. Brielle stood frozen in front of the mirrored elevator doors inside the Nolan Tower, 25 floors above the Manhattan skyline. Her reflection stared back wide-eyed, uncertain, and wearing a navy shift dress she'd borrowed from her neighbor upstairs. The bracelet Beckett had given her still circled her wrist like a dare. She hadn't expected him to follow through. Not really. Men like him didn't make second calls to women who lived 3 subway transfers from the city center. But he had. 2 days after the wedding, he'd shown up outside her apartment in a black BMW Alpina, leaned against the hood like he belonged in a fragrance ad, and told her, I thought we could grab lunch. I know a place. The place turned out to be a rooftop garden restaurant that served courses with names she couldn't pronounce and views that made her forget to breathe. Now, 3 dates later, she was standing in the elevator of his building for the first time on his invitation. Come up, he'd said earlier that afternoon over coffee in a quiet corner of a bookstore cafe. I want to show you something. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors parted onto the penthouse floor. No hallway, no neighbors, just a single wide entrance framed in black steel and frosted glass. Before she could knock, the door opened. Beckett wore a dark button-down tucked into slate gray trousers, his sleeves casually rolled. He stepped back, letting her in without a word. The space behind him unfolded like something from a dream floor to ceiling windows, sleek Italian furniture, a fireplace flickering beneath a sprawling abstract painting. You live here? Brielle asked before she could stop herself. For now, he replied, watching her take it in. I bounce between a few places depending on what's going on. She turned slowly in the foyer, taking in the way the city lights bled across the marble floors. This looks like a luxury hotel. I had it redone last year. The architect owed me a favor. She followed him through the open living space, past a glass-enclosed wine cellar and a kitchen that gleamed like a showroom. He led her to a side room she hadn't noticed, a studio of some kind. Inside, the walls were lined with framed black and white photographs. Cityscapes, candid portraits, a few shots of children playing in fountains captured mid-laughter. You took these? She asked, stepping closer to a photo of an elderly man playing chess near Central Park. I did, he said quietly. Photography was my first love. I used to think I'd do it full-time. What stopped you? My father died when I was 22. I inherited the company and things changed overnight. She looked at him, really looked, the way his jaw tightened, the faint crease between his brows. I didn't know, she said softly. Most people don't. I don't talk about it. Do you miss it? Taking photos, he nodded once. Every day. Brielle turned back to the gallery wall. They're incredible, Beckett. You see people, the real parts of them. His voice was quiet. So do you? She glanced at him, unsure how to respond to that, but before she could speak, he motioned toward the far end of the room where a slim door stood slightly ajar. There's something else I want to show you. Past the door was a terrace that stretched the length of the penthouse. A narrow pool shimmered under soft garden lights, and a long teak table was set for two beneath a canopy of string lights. You did this? She asked, startled. I figured if I was inviting you into my world, I should at least feed you something you recognize, he said with a faint smile. On the table sat a large bowl of homemade pasta, a bottle of red wine already breathing beside it. You made this. I can follow a recipe, he said, pulling out a chair for her. Mostly. She sank into the seat, still overwhelmed by the contrast between simple food and extravagant setting. "You're full of contradictions, you know that?" He poured her a glass, then sat across from her. "I get that a lot." Over dinner, they talked about everything except what they were beginning to feel. He asked about her job at the marketing agency, about her dream to write one day, about her grandmother who used to write poems on napkins just to make her laugh. In return, she asked nothing about his money. Not because she didn't wonder, but because she was afraid to know just how far apart their lives really were. It wasn't until they were finishing the last of the wine that he grew quiet. "I want to tell you something," he said, his gaze fixed on the skyline beyond the terrace. Brielle waited. "I don't bring people here, not friends, not dates. Most people only ever see the boardroom side of me." He paused. "But you make things feel different." Her breath caught. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I just needed you to know that." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Thank you for showing me this part of you." His fingers curled around hers, warm and steady. "You make it easy," he said, the moment stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then his phone began to buzz from inside the apartment. He frowned and stood. "Sorry, give me 1 minute," she nodded, watching him disappear through the terrace door. Alone under the lights, Brielle glanced around the terrace again. Everything glittered. Everything was perfect. And yet something in her gut twisted. When he returned, his expression had shifted tense, his jaw set. "Everything okay?" she asked. He hesitated. "That was my lawyer," she blinked. "Is something wrong?" He looked at her like he was trying to decide whether to lie. Then finally he said, "My uncle's contesting the estate again. Says I wasn't supposed to inherit the company. He's trying to block an acquisition we've been working on for months." "Can he do that?" "Only if he proves I'm not fit to lead." "Fit," she repeated. "What does that even mean?" "Stable, reliable, settled," she frowned. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe, but the board has to take it seriously, which means I have to take it seriously." She studied his face, the calm mask slipping just enough to show the pressure beneath. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. His eyes met hers. "Actually, there might be." She tilted her head. "Say it," he exhaled slowly. "They want to see me with someone steady, grounded, someone who makes me look less volatile." She blinked. "Are you saying?" "I know it's insane, we've only just met, but if you were with me publicly it could help." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? I know it's a lot, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." Brielle leaned back in her chair, her thoughts a storm. "I'm just some girl you met at a wedding dinner." He reached for her hand again. "You're not just anything." Silence fell between them like a held breath. Then she said, "If I say yes, what happens next?" His grip tightened gently. "Then we make them believe it. Starting with the gala tomorrow night." The instant Brielle stepped out of the car and onto the crimson-carpeted entrance of the Langford Gala, she realized Beckett hadn't been exaggerating when he said it was a bit formal. The crowd glittered. Men in sharp tuxedos. Women in gowns that whispered secrets when they moved. And in the middle of it all, the flash of cameras, the murmur of polished laughter, and a string quartet playing something haunting and expensive. Beside her, Beckett offered his arm. He wore a midnight suit tailored so precisely it moved like liquid when he walked. His cufflinks were obsidian, and there was a quiet intensity in the way he looked at her, as though she were the only person who mattered in a sea of curated perfection. "Don't let go," he said under his breath. "I wasn't planning on it," she replied, lacing her fingers through his. She hadn't expected the stylist, or the driver, or the floor-length gown in a box with her name printed in gold across the lid. A gift, he'd said, for tonight. The fabric clung to her in a way that made her feel powerful, like she belonged in this world, even if her heart beat like she didn't. Inside the ballroom, everything shimmered. Chandeliers cast golden light across the marble floor. A glass staircase curved dramatically toward a mezzanine overflowing with champagne and speculation. The kind of event where names were currency and everyone spent theirs loudly. Beckett guided her through the crowd with practiced ease. A nod here, a handshake there. But he never let go of her hand, not once. "Is that the woman from the Baxter deal?" she murmured, eyeing a statuesque blonde in a velvet gown who seemed to be watching Beckett with pointed interest. He glanced her way, then leaned closer. That's Victoria Langford. Her father owns the venue. And yes, she's not subtle. Brielle raised an eyebrow. She looks like she wants to set you on fire or marry you, possibly both. She proposed a merger. I declined. His voice was dry, but there was tension in it. She doesn't like hearing no. Before Brielle could reply, a tall man with silver hair and a jaw like carved granite stepped into their path. He wore a three-piece suit that looked older than Brielle's entire existence and carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Beckett, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wasn't expecting to see you with a date. Beckett's grip didn't falter. Uncle Malcolm, this is Brielle Zander. The man's gaze swept over her like a ledger line. Charming, he said, though the words sounded like a warning. It's a pleasure to meet you, Brielle said evenly. I'm sure it is, Malcolm replied, eyes flicking between them. She'll be joining us for the board brunch next weekend, I assume. Of course, Beckett said without hesitation. Good. I look forward to hearing her thoughts on Nolan acquisitions, Malcolm said before disappearing into the crowd like smoke. Brielle turned to Beckett. He's the one trying to push you out, isn't he? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They made their way toward the mezzanine, where an orchestra played something delicate from a raised platform. Beckett led her to the railing, away from the press of conversation. You handled that well, he said. I didn't know I was auditioning. You weren't. That's what made it perfect. Brielle leaned against the railing. Does he scare you? I don't scare easily, Beckett said. But he's dangerous. He's been planning this since the day the will was read. She looked up at him. Why now? Because I'm close to finalizing the Oslo merger. Once that's done, I'll control 70% of the board. He knows this is his last shot. And your plan is to parade me in front of them like some kind of stability mascot. He turned toward her, his expression serious. That was never the point. I asked you here because I trust you. Because when I'm with you, I remember who I am outside all of this. She wasn't expecting that, the openness, the weight behind his words. I didn't grow up with this, she said. Galas, mergers, strategies, I'm still figuring out which fork to use. He brushed a curl behind her ear. You used the right one, that's all that matters. They stood in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. Then she asked, what happens if this doesn't work, if the board sides with him? I lose everything, he said simply. But you're not part of that. You don't owe me anything. But I want to be part of it, she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, really looked, like he couldn't believe she'd just said that. I've only known you for a few weeks, Beckett, she continued. But I've never seen someone fight so hard just to stay true to what they built. He stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing. You've seen more of me in days than most people have in years, he said. Before she could answer, a loud voice interrupted from behind. That's her, isn't it? The girl he's been hiding. They turned to find Victoria Langford approaching, her expression equal parts amusement and venom. Well, she said, eyes flicking to Brielle, you're prettier than I expected. Though I suppose that was the point. Brielle didn't flinch. I'm sorry, have we met? Victoria's smile sharpened. Not officially, but I've been told you're quite the distraction. Beckett stepped forward. Victoria, this isn't the time. Oh, but it is, she said sweetly. The board deserves to know who's influencing your decisions, especially if you're planning to install a civilian in the inner circle. Brielle raised her chin. I'm not here for your approval, and I'm certainly not here for a title. Victoria's expression faltered for just a moment. Beckett's voice was low and firm. Walk away. Victoria hesitated, then turned with a flick of her gown and vanished into the crowd. Brielle exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. You okay? Beckett asked. No, she admitted, but I will be. He took her hand again. Come with me. He led her down a hallway behind the mezzanine, past staff-only signs and velvet ropes until they reached a private terrace that overlooked the city. The air was cool and the noise of the party faded behind them. I've never done this before, she said quietly. This, faked a relationship, worn a dress I didn't buy, faced off with women who could ruin me with a phone call. Beckett turned to her. You weren't pretending in there, not once, that was all you. She looked out at the skyline, then back at him. What happens after Oslo? His answer was quiet. That depends on you. I don't want to be temporary, Beckett. Then don't be. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. Without a word, he handed it to her. Inside was a deed, her name, a storefront. Mid-Manhattan. I bought it yesterday. You said you wanted to write, open a studio, do something that mattered. If you want it, it's yours. Her breath caught. You can't just I can, and I did. Not because I'm trying to impress you, but because I believe in you. She stepped back, overwhelmed. I need time. You'll have it, he said softly. But know this, Brielle, I'm not doing any of this because I need to win. I'm doing it because I don't want to lose you. The city glowed below them, but all she could see was the man in front of her, offering her not just his world, but a place to build her own. Rain dotted the windows of the corner cafe where Brielle sat alone, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. It had been 5 days since the gala. 5 days since Beckett had handed her a deed with her name on it and said he believed in her future more than anyone ever had. And she'd walked away, not because she didn't want him, not because she didn't feel everything in her bones when he looked at her like she was already his, but because it had all spiraled too fast. The lights, the wealth, the expectations, she was still trying to understand the language of that world, and suddenly she was being offered a storefront like it was an accessory. But the truth was, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him. Not once. Not when she sat in her tiny kitchen staring at the envelope. Not when the building on East 74th Street appeared in her dreams. And not when she ran her fingers over the bracelet every night before bed, still cold, still heavy with meaning, the bell above the door chimed. She didn't have to look to know it was him. You always drink your tea cold? Beckett asked, his voice low, unfamiliar in its restraint. She looked up. He was soaked through, no umbrella, his hair darker from the rain. There was something raw in the way he stood there, as if he hadn't slept. I wasn't expecting you, she said. I wasn't sure I'd come, he admitted. But then I realized I've never chased anything in my life, not really. Not until you. Why now? Because I finally understood that letting you walk away was the only thing I've done that actually scared me. She pushed the tea aside. It wasn't about you, Beckett. I needed to breathe. I needed to know I was still me in all of this. I get that, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. But I need you to understand something too. That building wasn't a bribe. It wasn't some grand move to keep you close. It was the first time I've ever looked at my resources and thought, how can I make someone else's dream real? I didn't know what to do with that, she said. No one's ever handed me anything. I wasn't handing it to you. I was giving you a foundation. You still have to build it. She studied him for a long moment. What if I fail? Then you fail spectacularly, and I'll be there to help you get back up, he said without hesitation. The table between them felt suddenly too small for the weight of what hovered in the air. I've been writing, she said finally, every day since the gala. His eyes lit up, not with triumph, but with something gentler. Good. I even outlined a collection, short stories, inspired by people I've met, things I've seen. Am I in them? He asked, mouth twitching at the corner. There's a character, he's arrogant, brooding, owns a building and doesn't know how to take no for an answer. Sounds insufferable. He grows on you. Beckett leaned forward, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I didn't fall in love with you because you were different from my world. I fell in love with you because you reminded me I had a heart, her breath caught. You love me. I haven't stopped since the moment you told me you came for cake and left with a millionaire you didn't ask for. She laughed, eyes burning. You're ridiculous. I'm yours. She inhaled shakily. I want to say it back, only if you mean it. I do. Her voice trembled. I do love you, Beckett, even when you terrify me. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Then don't run, come with me. Where? He stood, extending his hand. You'll see. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. He led her to a narrow street she didn't recognize, tucked between galleries and bookstores. And there it was. The storefront, real, clean, with her name now etched in gold script across the glass, Zander & Co. Story, studio, and collective. She stared, stunned. You had that done. You said you didn't want to do it alone, so I found a way to make it ours. Ours, he turned to her. I want you in my life, Brielle, not just as a name on a deed or a date for a gala. I want the late nights, the rewrites. The fights over paint colors and which font to put on the window. I want all of it. She reached for the keys he held out, her hand trembling. What if I'm not ready? Then we take it slow, but we take it together. Inside, the space was still bare. Just wooden floors, white walls, and the scent of fresh varnish. But it felt like possibility, like a page waiting for its first word. Beckett walked to the center of the room, turned, and opened a small velvet box, not with a ring, but a silver pen. Simple, elegant. I was going to wait, he said. But this felt like the right moment. Write it, Brielle, your story, our story, whatever you want. She stepped into the room, into his space, into the life he was offering. I'll write it, she said, taking the pen. But only if you promise to stop calling yourself insufferable characters in my stories. He grinned, rain lingering on his lashes. Deal. Months later, the studio's walls were filled with framed pages, handwritten drafts, and photos of their first workshop attendees. Children, artists, writers who had never had a space to speak. And in the back, a small office with 2 desks, one for her laptop and manuscripts, the other for Beckett's old film camera and prints he'd finally dusted off. Their lives didn't become quieter, but they became fuller. Richer. And every time she passed the gold lettering on the door, she remembered that it had all started because she said yes to a wedding dinner and left with far more than cake. Brielle stood inside the studio's back office, barefoot on the honeyed wood floor, flipping through a stack of newly printed brochures for their upcoming community story initiative. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, warming her shoulders, and the faint hum of voices from the front room drifted in, writers, kids, artists, all finding their rhythm inside the space she and Beckett had built. She tucked the last brochure into the display rack, then turned as the door opened. Beckett stepped in, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a thin streak of ink across his forearm. You've got something on you, she said, nodding to the smudge. He glanced down. I tried to fix the sign outside. The E was peeling. You're not allowed near letters anymore. That's what the professionals are for. He leaned against the doorframe. I thought I was the professional. You're the investor, not the sign technician. Investor, he repeated, walking toward her. I thought I was your partner. She tilted her head. Are you fishing for reassurance? Maybe, he said, slipping his arms around her waist. It's been a long week. She softened into his chest. You closed with Oslo. That's not just a long week. That's a landmark. He kissed the top of her head. Feels like it happened in another lifetime. Like the version of me who cared about boardroom politics is a stranger now. You still care, she murmured. You're just not defined by it anymore. He was quiet for a beat. I got a call this morning. Malcolm's stepping down, officially. Brielle pulled back to look at him. Voluntarily, he said it was time, that the board needs someone with vision and that I proved I had it. She searched his face. How do you feel? Relieved and sadder than I expected. He paused. He was still my family. For all the damage he did, part of me always wanted him to believe in me. She threaded her fingers through his. That's human, Beckett, but you built this life without his approval, and now you're free to build the rest of it on your terms. He nodded slowly. And I want to spend the rest of it with you. Her breath caught, but he wasn't finished. I've been thinking, he said, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out a small, square envelope. You gave me your words, your stories, your trust. I want to give you something in return. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, slightly grainy, of her, captured during their first week in the studio. She was mid-laugh, head thrown back, papers scattered across her desk. I developed it myself, he said. It's the only print I've ever made that I couldn't bring myself to sell. She traced the edges with her thumb. I remember this moment. You were making fun of the way I organized drafts by coffee stains. I wasn't making fun. I was falling in love. She looked up at him, eyes misting. You're really not afraid to say it anymore. I'm not afraid of anything with you, he said. A knock sounded at the door. Come in, Brielle called, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Talia poked her head in, holding a clipboard. Sorry to interrupt the love fest, but the event coordinator needs you both up front. Something about seating charts and a missing microphone. Beckett groaned. Why did we agree to host a citywide showcase again? Because you're both masochists, Talia said cheerfully, retreating. They followed her into the main room, now bustling with volunteers and early attendees. A banner hung across the center wall, Voices of the City, a Night of Stories, sponsored by Zander & Co. and Nolan Foundation. Brielle stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people took their seats, teenagers with nervous eyes, older men and women holding worn notebooks, a young girl clinging to a folder covered in marker hearts. Beckett leaned in. "You did this." "No," she said. "We did." The event unfolded with laughter, applause, and more than a few tears. When it was Brielle's turn to speak, she took the mic with steady hands. 3 months ago, she began, this space didn't exist. It was just an idea born in a moment that felt impossible. But someone believed in me before I believed in myself. And tonight, I hope you all feel that, too, that your voice matters, that your story matters. After the last round of applause echoed through the room and the final reader stepped down from the stage, Beckett found her again beneath the banner, his expression unreadable. She raised an eyebrow. "You look like you're about to tell me something important. I have one more thing, one last surprise." She crossed her arms playfully. "Another building, a yacht, a bookstore in Paris." "Not quite." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, velvet box. Her heart stopped. "I know we've done everything backward," he said. "I know we started with fake and fell into real, but I want to make this official. No pretense, no strategy, just us." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, a single sapphire set in platinum. She blinked. "Why a sapphire?" he smiled. "Because it was the first thing I gave you, and because it still reminds me of the night I knew." Brielle reached for him, her hands shaking. "Yes, of course, yes." The room erupted into applause, though she barely registered it. All she saw was him, his eyes, his smile, the way he held her like home. They married 3 months later in a quiet ceremony held in the very studio where it all began. No gala, no press, just fairy lights, handwritten vows, and the scent of lavender drifting in from the windows. Brielle didn't wear white. She wore ink-stained blue, and Beckett wore the same cufflinks he'd worn the night they met. Talia officiated, crying halfway through, and afterward they danced barefoot to an old record playing on a borrowed turntable. Years later, the studio had expanded into a small publishing imprint. Brielle's first collection found its way into classrooms and libraries. Beckett's photographs graced the covers. They traveled often, always returning to the city that had brought them together. On Sunday mornings, they read aloud on their rooftop garden, the one he'd once lit with string lights for her, now blooming with wildflowers and herbs. They never stopped choosing each other. Not when the world shifted, not when success threatened to pull them in different directions. And every time Brielle glanced down at the bracelet still circling her wrist, she remembered the girl who walked into a borrowed night and left with a future she never dreamed possible. She'd come for cake, she stayed for love.